Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Legatum Institute and the 2020 Courage in Journalism Awards. It's a real privilege to see so many people here this evening. My name is Nathan Gamester. The Legatum Institute, for those who may not know, is a think tank dedicated to seeing people move from poverty to prosperity. We're headquartered here in London, but our work is international. This year alone, we have projects in Ethiopia, Ghana, India, Colombia, Morocco, Romania, and Zimbabwe, among other places. This evening is a very special evening in our calendar. The Courage in Journalism Award is unlike anything else that we do. Its origins are very special too, and I'll come to that shortly, but first I'd like to take a step back. The issue of journalist safety and more broadly media freedom has been catapulted to the front of national dialogue in recent years for reasons that are both tragic but important. We've read, watched and listened to discussions about media freedom and journalist safety through the stories of Marie Colvin, Daphne Caruana Galizia, Lyra McKee, Jamal Khashoggi and many others. And these are individual cases, but we've also seen the more nuanced attempts to silence free journalism. This is not where journalists are specifically targeted or thrown in prison. Rather, as Freedom House notes, around the world, common methods include government-backed ownership changes, regulatory and financial pressure, and public denunciations of honest journalists. Governments also offer preferential access to state information. The goal is to make the press serve those in power rather than the public. And Freedom House calls out many specific countries, from India to Austria and Hungary to the US, where active efforts are underway to discredit, undermine, and subdue media freedom. Now, very few of us in the room tonight will need any persuading of the importance of a free press, but it's always worth stating and restating why. Last week I interviewed the exiled Mexican journalist Annabel Hernandez, and she summed it up superbly. Now, Annabel has spent her career uncovering and documenting corruption of the highest order in Mexico. And Mexico today is about the worst place in the world to be a journalist, which only increases the importance for free media. And she said this to me: in Mexico, if I'm a criminal or a corrupted official, the only thing that is uncomfortable to me is a journalist. I can talk with the judge, by talk she means bribe. I can talk to the judge, I can talk with the Attorney General, I can talk with the Senator, but I cannot negotiate with a journalist. So the only thing uncomfortable to me is the journalist. So it's better to kill him or kill her. And we'll hear more from Annabel tonight, and we'll hear more about Mexico. But before I get to that, I want to highlight the origins of this award. The history of this award starts with someone I've already mentioned. When Daphne Caruana Galizia was murdered by a car bomb as she was driving away from her home in Malta in October 2017, my colleagues and I here read the news with both shock and sadness, as I'm sure everyone else in the room did too. The thing that made this feel closer to home than it otherwise would have done is that Daphne's son Paul was a colleague of ours at the Institute until just before the incident took place. Paul worked on our metrics team and had been at the heart of our signature publication, the Annual Prosperity Index. Many of us were still in contact with Paul at the time and remain so today. And so in communication with Paul through messages and phone calls, we realised that we wanted to do something to mark Daphne's passing and to honour her legacy. And so the Courage in Journalism Award was established for Daphne and the entire Caruana Galizia family. The Prosperity Index I mentioned just now is a report that analyses countries around the world on a wide range of indicators to produce a set of rankings that goes beyond the traditional, mainly economic indicators. One of the pillars of any prosperous society is freedom, and so we measure that in the index. And within that measure of freedom, we include several components of media freedom that we assess each country on. Given this historic work of ours looking at media freedom, coupled with another strand of our work that looks at courage, and our proximity to the Caruana Galizia family, in late 2017, the Courage in Journalism Award was born. Daphne's life and her work show why a free press is so important. Daphne was a fully independent journalist. She was the first female journalist to write a political column in Malta. She published a large amount of work on her own website and was a constant thorn in the side of not just the Maltese government, but many others in her pursuit of truth, as she exposed corruption and cover-ups. To give you a sense of how popular and important her work was, here is how Paul, her son, describes his mother's impact. In Malta, everyone read Daphne. Our surname was redundant. In a country of 475,000 people, her website received 400,000 unique visitors a day, more than 1 million during election campaigns, and a greater number than the combined readership of all Malta's dailies. To me, this put in stark perspective the words of Annabel Hernandez I read earlier. If I'm a corrupt official, the only thing uncomfortable to me is the journalist. And the reality is that journalists are paying with their lives, and sadly that was the case for Daphne and some of the other journalists that we will focus on tonight. So far I've mentioned several high-profile individual cases. Then it could be tempting to think that this is what the issue is, a series of individual cases, but that would not be accurate either. We track aspects of media freedom in our Prosperity Index, and that data, along with various information from other global organisations, paints a clear picture. Media freedom has been declining globally this year and over the last decade. The deterioration of freedom of speech and access to information over the last decade has been seen in every region of the world and in 120 of the 167 countries covered in the Prosperity Index. In that same report says this: physical repression of journalists, government censorship of the press and media, political diversity of media perspectives, and freedom of opinion and expression are all at lower levels than they were a decade prior. Freedom House describes this situation as a downward spiral in its 2019 report. And so while we often look at this issue through the lens of individual cases, and for good reason, it's really important to recognise the wider landscape that exists. Media freedom and freedom of the press are under threat. We may not feel it or experience it here in central London, but these stats and the many stories we'll hear tonight paint for us a very clear picture. And so against this backdrop, we decided 3 years ago to establish this initiative to call out these issues and draw attention to the places and practices that stifle media freedom. Of course, our aim with the Courage in Journalism Award is not just to single out one person. For reasons that are obvious, there is no winner this evening. But in the process of identifying one final recipient, our aim is to bring attention to the many. I've mentioned some high-profile examples already, names you will have heard before. But you probably haven't heard of Ahmed Hussein Suel de Vela, the Ghanaian journalist who uncovered one of the biggest corruption scandals in Ghanaian football. Norma Sarabia Garduza, the Mexican journalist who reported on local crime in her hometown. Ali Shah Rajpal, the Pakistani journalist and reporter investigating corruption in his municipal government, who also served as chairman of his local press club. These are just some of the brave journalists who were killed between October 2018 and October 2019, who our judging panel looked at for this year's award. Their names deserve to be known, their stories deserve to be told, and we've made their profiles available on our website, and I encourage you to go there and read them for yourselves. And so too our judging panel. I'm delighted to say that all of our distinguished judges who served last year agreed to do so again this year. In a moment we'll hear from two of them, but first, by way of introduction, they are, and they're on the screen as well, Abir Sadi, a war correspondent with close to 30 years' experience in conflict zones covering the Middle East and Africa in countries such as Iraq, Libya, Yemen and Syria. Abir trains journalists to prepare them for work in war-torn regions. Christina Lamb, who's the Sunday Times chief foreign correspondent and best-selling author. Con Coughlin, the Telegraph's defence editor and chief foreign affairs columnist. Kate Clark, who's the co-director of the Afghanistan Analyst Network, and among other things, in 1999, Kate was the BBC's Kabul correspondent, the only Western journalist based in the country at the time. David Freud, who as a journalist worked at the Financial Times for 8 years and also served in government in the UK as Minister of State for Welfare Reform. And finally, Mike Thompson, the BBC World Affairs correspondent, whose reports you will frequently hear and read across multiple BBC platforms. And later this evening, Mike will be giving some keynote remarks for us. Now, there is one downside of convening such an impressive group of foreign affairs journalists. It's incredibly hard to get them all in the same room at the same time. A theory we are proving this evening, as sadly Con, David and Christina have all been called away at the last minute on business. But I'm delighted that Kate, Mike and Abir are here, and perhaps you could join me in thanking all of them for their involvement in and commitment to this initiative. In conversation with David Freud last year, David said to me that he'd like to use this initiative to really call out those countries in which the situation is most difficult for journalists. That beyond being an award for courageous journalism, this should be a way of drawing attention to and even shaming those nations in which it's hardest to be a journalist. And we've taken on that challenge this year. As we reviewed the data, one country stuck out more than others. From the full list of journalists killed, the country that recorded the highest number was Mexico. And our judging panel decided that we wanted to shine a light on this, and so I have a short video to show in just a moment. But before that, let me add a little background to the situation. Of our 55 journalists considered for this year's award, 22% were killed in Mexico. Outside of a war zone, Mexico is the most dangerous place in the world to be a journalist. Since the year 2000, 150 journalists in Mexico have been murdered, and many more have simply disappeared, assumed dead. The federal mechanism that exists in Mexico to protect journalists has been described as understaffed, underfunded, and unable to respond quickly with appropriate measures. Last week, a colleague and I travelled to visit Annabel Hernandez to ask her what it's like to be an investigative journalist in Mexico. For her safety, I can't disclose where the interview took place. She was forced to leave Mexico after several threats were made against her life and the life of her family. We had a very wide-ranging conversations, which at times, as you'll see in the video, was very passionate. And she's very passionate about these issues, as you can imagine why. And we've somehow clipped that conversation down to 3.5 minutes, and we're going to play that now.
I am Annabel Hernandez. I am a Mexican investigative journalist. I have been covering issues related with corruption, abuse of power, violations of human rights, and the drug cartels. I found through a very long investigation that in Mexico exists one group of very high-level officials in the police, in the army, even the president that was involved with the Sinaloa cartel. I published my research in one book called Los Señores del Narco, translated in English in Narcoland. So because this, the Secretary of Public Security, Genaro Garcia Luna, and a group of very corrupted policemen that worked for him ordered to kill me. All the people that threatened me, all the people that left the animals, the people that entered to my house, the people that killed my sources, all these people are still walking in Mexico. It's not safe for me, and it's not safe for anyone. But until these 10 years that I have been under threats, 100 Mexican journalists have been murdered. Because these journalists is the only uncomfortable thing for me, because I can talk with the judge, I can talk with the Attorney General office, I can talk with the senator, but I cannot negotiate with the journalist. So the only thing uncomfortable for me, that I am a criminal or corrupted official, is the journalist. So it's better to kill him or kill her, because even that, I will not be in jail. So the impunity is one of the most terrible ingredients in this chaos. So when you talk about danger, it's difficult because yes, it's dangerous, but I am alive. Many of my friends cannot say the same. I'm sure that is the same spirit of all the journalists in the world. We don't want flowers in our tombs. We don't want a name in a newspaper. We want to be live, enjoy the life, and keep doing our job. Of course, I am afraid. Of course, sometimes I want to stop myself. Of course. But the problem is that I don't want to. I make the choice. Every time that I will start a new investigation, I made the choice to not keep silent. I made the choice to do my job, because also for me, be a journalist is my life. If I'm not a journalist, I cannot say that I am alive.
I'm now going to invite Kate and Abir to the stage to talk about some of the issues raised in that video, and also to get into something of the methodology that we used in order to decide on this year's recipient for the award. So, Kate and Abir. Abir, I'll start with you, if that's okay. One of the things Annabel and I discussed was the need for better training of Mexican journalists, particularly local journalists. Now, your career is to go to some of the most dangerous places in the world and train journalists. Tell us a little bit about your experience and what type of training can work in some of the most desperate situations.
I totally agree with Annabel about the training. The training is important, and I just add, it's not only during when you already become a journalist. And I mean, like in journalism school, there should be safety trainers, should be obligatory for everyone. And it's not only the war reporting, because like war is an exceptional situation, but conflicts happens everywhere, and we find the journalists now, the investigative journalists, and taking the case of Daphne, are more targeted. So we do those kind of training. The problem is that those trainings used to be very expensive, only for the elite journalists who works for international organization. What we need to do, and this is what we are trying to do, maybe as other organization, including the International Association of Women in Radio and Television, we go to the people who work on the ground, the people who really this, and I mean the local journalists. And as you see here, the most of the killings happened on this. But I want just to add, and I will always say, the lack of impunity is the biggest problem that we have. Because if you provide the training, and I mean the insurance as well, because it's important, and the good work conditions, but you have to really don't and chase those who really kill and attack the journalists, because the message, the negative message about the journalist and no one is getting a judgment, this is really big impact.
Thank you. Kate, thinking about the judging process this year, we started with a long list of 55 journalists. What were your initial reflections on seeing that list?
Well, it's always very distressing. You actually feel like you're being a bit ghoulish because you're celebrating dead people. And I know when I first looked at the list, I thought, what on earth am I doing this? And it's only the fact that it's been set up by the family of Daphne Caruana Galizia that it sort of gives it a seal of approval for me. Otherwise, you know, it's not a celebratory award. This is not a celebratory award. It's commemorative. It's an award of protest, of trying to shame governments and non-governments to do more. I think it's important, but it's really distressing looking through that list. And it's, you know, it's young people who are just starting out on their careers. It's old, experienced journalists that are know exactly what they're doing, and they do it anyway. And, you know, I think, you know, many of us have done difficult journalism, but I can always come home to Britain. It's not like I'm doing journalism on my home patch with my family there, and probably, you know, corrupt police or a government that won't protect me. It's a very different scenario, much, much more courageous. And
Abir, on that list, were there any patterns or themes that that you saw as you read through and looked at the biographies of the 55 journalists?
Yeah, it's more and more, no one is casually killed. Like even last year when we speak about like the bombing, it was bombing for a gathering that there is a journalist in. But here it's more like shooting, if I'm calling the numbers, like most, number one is shooting. Number two is the beating for death, because the beating for death, they can simply kill the person. But when you do beat for death, that means you send the message to others that this is a forbidden area. There were more targeting of people who are working on investigative reporting, or the people who really decide to take one case to the end, which is corruption, anti-extremism, all those kind of things. And there was women as well. And one just stress that women, it starts a whole thing here by Daphne, which is a woman journalist to work in the investigative reporting. But until 4 days ago, and journalists from Mexico And Mexico really stands for a big patterns, because like 12 journalists died this year in Mexico, and we're starting 2020 with another death of a female journalist. So this is really a big pattern. They are targeted, they are killed, and one thing stands up is the lack of impunity. And many of those victims who were really victimized in that, some of them seeked help. They seeked help. It was not the first thing that they take. They have got threats. And those threats by the government, they didn't take the protections that they need, which because some of the local governments are really, really part of this corruption, which means that there should be a bigger power in that. So there is a lot of patterns, and it happens from one country to the other. So we're speaking about Mexico, we're speaking about Pakistan, we're speaking about Syria, we're speaking about even the countries that is not in war. And so this is the biggest pattern in that. Yeah.
Thank you. So, Kate, you've got the full list of 55 in front of you. How do you begin the process of moving towards picking a final recipient?
Well, I guess the first thing to say is that there are many sources of risk as a journalist. You know, there's your own government, corrupt local government officials, there's the mafia, there's authoritarian states, there's armed groups. There may be groups that don't like you for your social views. I mean, there's many people that you can offend and get on the wrong side of. And I think we wanted to be sort of neutral as far as that went. And we were looking at what the journalist had done. So firstly, that they were targeted, that it wasn't just they weren't just caught in the line of fire, for example, that they were aware of what they were doing and continued anyway. So they were knowingly doing knowingly doing what they were doing, that they were reporting or investigating something serious wrongdoing, and that they had an impact, and that was just a way for us to try and sift between 6 individuals, all of whom needed honouring, and each one of them could have won the award. So it was just a way for us to sift through the list.
Yeah, and when you as judges applied that lens, that matrix, you took the list from 55 down to a short list of 6. And Abir, can you talk about how the panel decided from that group of 6 to the final recipient?
I'd like to pick up what Kate said. It was not easy, actually, because like all of them are heroes. All of them don't lack the courage. And the issue is that all of them should be recognized. But at the end of the day, we put high, no one of us as judges had any prejudice. We were all there. We met several times and we wanted to really know. And the issue here was they know what they want. This was the number one side, so they choose it. But as Annabel said, they choose to do what they want. They didn't choose to die, but they knew what they were in the choice. They didn't want to be silent. And this is the message. And the message coming out of this, because this is the biggest thing coming, is that we need those people to be remembered in a good way. We need people to know. And we were thinking as well about the local journalists, the journalists who were back home, they stayed, that the conflict came to them. Actually, they were not there. And we were speaking about, we had an eye on that, and we had an eye on the new generation. When we protect journalists, we don't protect journalists because there are a lot of civilians in the conflict zones. But we want the truth to be said and to be seen, and it can be seen by those. So the message, and I'm not going to reveal who's at the end, you're going to do this in 2 minutes, but let me say, like we think with this year, we have a strong message for a lot of local journalists who operate there, and it will make a lot of one of them to be resilient and to do what they work, which is really a work that matters.
Thank you. Kate, just taking a step back now, I've said just now the sort of the trends in media freedom around the world tend to be going in the wrong direction. Why do you think that is, and what can be done about it?
Well, I think one of the shocking things for me on this list was out of the 5 countries that had the highest numbers of dead journalists on our list, 3 were conflict zones, and you sort of expect civilians, including journalists, to die in places like Afghanistan, Somalia and Syria. But the 2 top ones are not at war, Pakistan and Mexico. So 7 journalists on the list from Pakistan, 12 from Mexico. This is shocking, Really, really shocking. And usually it's part of wider trends. So it's to do with, you know, the police being corrupt, government being corrupt, bigger forces that journalists on the ground are trying to hold to account. And we can see in some of the countries where there's greater authoritarianism, or you know, the mafia or drugs cartels are becoming more important in politics. Yeah. You tread on toes, and there are consequences if you're unlucky. So I think I would say it's part of the wider politics and global trends.
Great, thank you. Abir, final question to you. Just picking up on what Kate said, you spend your career going around the world in some of these very difficult situations. Give us a sense of what that's like, and do you see cause for optimism through that? Are there sort of points of hope that you can point to that you see in your work?
I see a resilience generation happening here, because like whatever is happening in those zones, it's really depressing. But when you see, because I go there and I train the new generation, and this really gives me hope. So when you go to the place when it should send all the negative energy there, you find new generation, because usually in these conflict zones there are very young people who really stay and want to come to journalism. So this is a profession that gets that's really matter, and the people want to stay to tell the story. I can end up with one thing here, if you allow me to call, because now we're celebrating the courage as well, but we want to have a call here for the impunity. And I think the lack of impunity is the biggest issue. And I was lucky that I attended part of the judgments in the Daphne. I went to Malta this year, and it really sent me a good message, because there was a lot of people and paying tribute for this courageous journalists. They were standing there speaking about it, and the nation, because we as journalists, we work for the people. We don't work for, she said here, I don't want my name here. We do it because we believe in. And there are simple people standing there demonstrating against the government. And this is really something that gave me personally a very good message. So please, let's give a call here for the lack of impunity, because it's #1 enemy. And we tell the young people to take, if I can take as a safety trainer, I tell them, take threats that you take seriously, because some threats turn into action. And many of those who were killed, it comes, those threats, and by the way, it doesn't only come directly, it comes online. So please, if there's anyone here, there's journalists or others, please take threats very seriously, because it matters.
Kate, Abir, thank you both very much.
Thank you.
We're now very close to announcing this year's recipient of the Courage in Journalism Award. Before we announce that, we're going to show a short video which shows the names and the faces of all those journalists on the long list for consideration this year, all of whom were killed between October 2018 and October 2019. Let's play that video now. I'm sure you'll agree it's a powerful video, and as the names roll on, it's hard to digest it all. If you would like to read the profiles of any of the 55 journalists on that list, they are available on our website. We encourage you to do that. As I said earlier, we want these people to be known, we want their stories to be told. It's now time to announce the recipient of this year's award. It's my privilege to reveal that this year's Courage in Journalism Award goes to the Syrian radio presenter and investigative journalist Raed Fares. Fares was the founder and director of the independent radio station Radio Fresh. He was shot and killed by unknown gunmen on the 23rd of November 2018 while en route to cover a protest in Kafr, Syria. Attackers in a silver van with tainted windows cornered Fares' vehicle and proceeded to open fire with machine guns. Fares was taken to Kafr Hospital, where he died shortly after the attack. Fares was a larger-than-life character. He had a big personality, was funny, warm, and very kind. His presenting style was unique. He employed a variety of unusual techniques on his radio station. He was also devoutly opposed to the Syrian regime and would use his platform to voice his opinions, but his methods were not typical. He used satirical videos, he used humour, and he did things deliberately in defiance of the Assad regime, ISIS, and Al-Qaeda. And he did all of this despite knowing fully the risks that he was taking. In a moment, we're going to hear from Mike Thompson, who is going to say a bit more about Raed Fares. Mike is the BBC's World Affairs correspondent and one of the judges for this year's award. And Mike is ideally placed to give remarks tonight because he got to know Raed Fares before his death and then subsequently made a superb BBC radio documentary about Fares' life. The documentary was called The Man Who Laughed at Al-Qaeda and is absolutely worth listening to as an intro to Raed Fares' life and his work. And before I invite Mike to the stage, I do have one more short video to show. We'd hoped to have some members of the Fares family here tonight, but their current refugee status in France made it impossible for them to travel to London. And so last week, we boarded the Eurostar and went to spend a day meeting Mahmoud Fares, who is Raed's eldest son. And we asked him to say a few words about his father and this award, and you're about to see the result. It's worth saying here that Mahmoud is, I think, one of the most remarkable people I've ever met. He's 24. He carries himself as someone much older and much wiser. What he's seen and lived through is extraordinary. And some of the stories he told us when we met were quite simply astonishing. For example, after we recorded the video, we sat and had a drink, and I asked Mahmoud why he and his family finally decided to leave Syria. He told me that one day he returned home and he found 3 bullets at the front of his house, and he knew exactly what that meant. He said, "The message to me and my brothers was clear. We got your father, and now we'll get you." And that was the moment he and his family decided to leave Syria. And I tell you that story to provide a bit of context about this young man's life and to show the courage that he and his family have shown even after the murder of their father. Let's watch this video now.
Good evening from France. Mercy and peace for all the lives of journalists who were killed for their cause. All journalists around the world deserve the honor because of their sacrifices, their life, in order to transfer the real image to the world. My father, Raed, who was the director of the Radio Fresh in Syria. It's a local radio in Kafr. It was publishing news programs and songs. My father received many death threats from Russia, Al-Assad regime, Al-Qaeda, and ISIS. However, he continued his struggles because he was believed in freedom and democracy for the Syrian people and all the oppressed in the world. All parties that were against the Syrian revolution hate Raed because he tried to communicate the voice of the Syrian revolution to the world. This thing didn't like much. He was subjected to an assassination attempt in 2014 by ISIS, but he revived it. My father always saying the revolution is an idea and the idea doesn't die. He always dreamed Syria without the Assad regime, and building a country that respects the right of its citizens. He sacrifices his life for us, for his cause, for his revolution. He's my hero. He's my hero. He died, but his ideas inside us. Thank you very much. My father will be very proud for this, and thank you for all. Thank you very much.
Incredibly powerful words from an extraordinary young man. Mahmoud, I know you will watch the video of this evening, and so I just want to say from everyone at the Legatum Institute and everyone in this room tonight, thank you for your words and for carrying on what is clearly a family tradition of demonstrating great courage. We wish you and your family the very best for this next chapter in your lives. It's now my great privilege to welcome Mike Thompson to the stage to deliver the keynote address and tell us a little bit more detail about Raed Faraz and why he is a worthy recipient of this year's Courage in Journalism Award. Mike.
I'd first like to say just how much Raed is worthy of this award, because for so many reasons, which I'll go into in a minute, but also because, unlike people like me, he lived it. He lived it for year upon year upon year. As Avir was talking about earlier with local journalists, you know, they are there. They don't like me. They don't arrive and disappear again. They are there all the time, and their families are there. Now, I've always found it hard to find anything to laugh about when it comes to Syria, given the hundreds of thousands of lives the war has cost and the many millions displaced. Yet Raed Faraz, a man who lived year after year, as I've just been saying, under the threat of death, somehow managed it. He bravely defied both Bashar al-Assad and Islamist extremists in calling for freedom of speech, democracy and women's rights, which was a big platform he had. And he never missed an opportunity to poke fun and laugh at those who had him in their sights. Humour was his biggest weapon, and he used it in some of the most imaginative and inspiring ways. Now, I first came across Raed in early 2017 when compiling a BBC report on what radio stations in his native rebel-held Idlib were broadcasting to civilians there. Now, I'd expected to hear screeching voices lashing out at full volume against the Assad regime and its allies, with perhaps hardened militia members shouting things like "fight to the death" in the background. Now, instead, when I tuned in to Radio Fresh FM, I heard a cacophony of tweeting birds, mooing cows and clucking chickens, interspersed with bongs of London's Big Ben and chanting football fans. All this sandwiched between news bulletins read by deep, robotic voices. Now, I checked the website address and was wondering whether this was some form of spoof broadcast. You know, surely it wasn't a real Syrian radio station. After all, this was a country at war, its people bombed and shelled. So who on earth would use the airwaves in such a way at a time like this? I soon had an answer to that question: Raed Faraz. I called him. A deep, relaxed voice answered, and after explaining who I was, I asked him why was his station broadcasting all these animal sounds and robot voices. After a brief laugh, he replied, a smile in his voice, "It's my sarcastic response to HTS." Now, for those who don't know, HTS, or Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, is an armed Islamist extremist group which still controls all the remaining opposition-held areas of Idlib and had its roots in Al-Qaeda. While its members share a hatred of President Assad with Raed and most civilians in Idlib, they have no truck with talk of democracy or human rights, and even less with the broadcasting of music. The group, which wants the return of Sharia law, regards that as haram or anti-Islamic. So they warned Raid that unless he stopped playing music, he and his staff would be arrested and the radio station shut down. Now, Raid could, of course, have simply obeyed that command, but that wasn't the Raid Faris way, especially given that he thought the demand was ridiculous. Instead, he told me he decided to have a little fun and make music in other ways. After all, birds sing, as do crowds of chanting football fans in a form, and who could deny that Big Ben's bongs are musical notes? But what about the robotic voices reading the news, I asked him. There's nothing much musical about those. No, came the voice on the other end of the line, but they are a big part of my sarcastic response. You see, HTS also demands that I take all my female presenters off air on the grounds that this too is haram. Women's voices, they've told me, should never be broadcast. Now, I was struggling to work out how this answer related to my question about the robotic voices, but after a brief pause and a small chuckle, Raid went on to explain that the only solution was to make his female colleagues sound like men. I put their voices through a computer software program, which makes them much deeper, just like a man's. I thought they sounded more like robots, but could sort of see his point. So what did HTS make of these supposedly male newsreaders, I asked him. Well, they were a little bewildered, he told me, and started demanding to be given access to the radio station to see what we were doing in there. But I told them, he said, surely your job is to monitor what we broadcast, not how we broadcast it. That, he added, seemed to satisfy them for a while, although the arguments soon resumed. Now, aside from finding all this very funny, I was left with several questions. Foremost amongst these was why Raid was taking such risks antagonizing armed extremists, a very dangerous sort of business, over things like playing music and who read the news. But it soon became clear that humour was the tool that he used to help achieve his aims, not the purpose in itself. Ever since the revolution began in 2011, and even way before that, in fact, Raid had campaigned for democracy and civil rights. He wanted journalists and the public at large to think for themselves and be free to voice their thoughts without fear of persecution. He didn't want anyone, whether a government or a militia group, imposing their ideas on others. Now, the Assad family had, of course, been doing that in Syria and continues to do so for decades. And the Raid was determined to stop Idlib's militia leaders becoming the new oppressors. It would be like, he told me, replacing one set of dictators with another. Now, while many people, including those in rebel-controlled areas, don't risk publicly insulting President Assad due to fears that one day they might fall into the hands of his very brutal security service, Raid threw such caution to the winds. He never stopped campaigning against the Damascus regime and even made an hilarious short video for this very purpose, which he posted on YouTube and which, in fact, Nathan referred to a little earlier, entitled The Syrian Revolution in 3 Minutes. Its cast were all dressed in caveman clothes, and on one side were civilians armed with clubs, and on the other were Assad's forces, all clutching machine guns and large bags labelled bombs. Everyone made loud grunting sounds and jumped up and down in true caveman fashion as they faced each other. Then the heavily armed soldiers swept in and gunned down all the club-clutching cavemen who collapsed in a heap. Meanwhile, sitting on a hill above were groups of people, also dressed in caveman costumes, chatting amongst each other, all completely ignoring the carnage below. Now, this group, you may not be surprised to hear, was Raid's portrayal of the international community during the Syrian war. Perhaps my favourite scene of all is when the slaughtered cavemen suddenly emerge from under palm fronds on the ground, grunting loudly with their fists in the air, and the text below simply says, Assad, even the dead want him gone. The promotion of women's rights was especially close to Raid's heart. He held workshops for women aiming at helping empower them in what's still a very patriarchal society, so there was no way he was going to take his female presenters off air just because some fanatic told him to do so. And, as if all this wasn't provocative enough, Raid also took part in and helped organise public protests against HTS. Many in Idlib believe that this group, unlike the Free Syrian Army fighters, give Idlib a very bad name and help Assad to justify his offensive there by claiming that the province is full of terrorists. Raid once sent me a short video of a bunch of gun-toting extremists arriving at a big demonstration against the Assad regime in his hometown of Kathmandu. No sooner had the militiamen jumped out of a pickup truck, swarms of civilian protesters surged around them and began pushing them back to their vehicle. Now, these guys were heavily armed. It's quite incredible. And as you might imagine, all this did not go down well with Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. They began arresting Raid more frequently and holding him for questioning. At first, these arrests, or more accurately, abductions, would be fairly brief and he'd be released within a day or two. But then these detentions became longer and more violent, and each time his family began to wonder if they'd see him again. After one of these occasions, I asked him whether, given all this, he planned to carry on defying HTS. Wasn't he worried that doing this might well get him killed? His reply was calm, almost nonchalant. They tried to do that 5 times, I think, but they haven't succeeded yet. But I think they will do it in the future. I will try to survive, but if I can't, it's okay. A few years earlier, in 2014, so-called Islamic State, or ISIS, had come very close to succeeded in doing just this. They had ruled Idlib before being ejected by HTS, and had also ordered Raid to stop his radio station playing music. When he failed to comply, 2 of their gunmen sprayed his car with bullets as he arrived home. More than 40 shots pierced his vehicle, and 2 hit him. He only narrowly survived and spent months recovering in hospital. Yet far from being silenced, this is what he said to his friends. "These ISIS gunmen are terrible shots, you know. 40 bullets! And they managed to miss my nose. And it's huge!" In October 2018, I'd arranged to interview Raid for BBC Radio and rang him at the agreed time. But he didn't answer. I heard nothing for 2 days, until a text finally popped up on my phone saying that he'd gone into hiding. His closest friend had been abducted by HTS the week before, and he said he was still being held. So the omens were not good, and he feared they'd be coming for him next. For months, Raid rarely slept at home with his wife and 3 sons due to fears for their safety if HTS came to kill him. Every night he moved from house to house, making it hard for the extremists to know where he'd be next. Instead of his normal car, he drove around on an old motorbike, often dressed in disguise. His wife, Montaha, told me how, despite all the tensions, she couldn't help bursting out laughing sometimes when he arrived at the house in the dark, wearing all kinds of strange clothes. His smile, she told me, always gave him away. Then, in November, Raid sent me a short text. He said simply, "I think it's personal this time." Not long after that, in late November 2018, I heard the awful news. He and a close friend had been gunned down soon after dropping by at his beloved Radio Fresh. It seemed almost impossible to take in. How could a man with such vitality, such courage, such extraordinary life force possibly have been silenced in seconds by a bunch of men with guns? And I still find that quite hard to believe. Yet his extraordinary legacy lives on in many ways. His humour, humanity, and amazing bravery have inspired people across Idlib, Syria, and much of the world. And he certainly inspired me. He showed that light can shine, even glow, in the darkest places and times. I remember asking him once what would happen to his radio station if Assad's forces overran Idlib. Surely that would be the end of it. The plan is, he says, not having any of what I just said, the plan is we have a transmitter with a car so we can hide ourselves and our vehicles in the fields and broadcast each time for 2 or 3 hours. You see, Mike, nobody can stop Radio Fresh from broadcasting. We will always find a way. And in memory of Raid, his colleagues at Radio Fresh have found a way. Even though the station's original studios in Raid's hometown of Catherine have been destroyed by bombs and the town taken over by government forces, the station, amazingly, is still broadcasting after the equipment was moved to another town a little further from the fighting. Tune in, you can hear it online, and in a way, it feels almost like to me you can hear him. Late last year, I visited Raid's family, who, as we were hearing from Nathan, have fled to France soon after his killing and now have been given asylum there. And his middle son, Mohammed, told me something that Mahmoud had also mentioned, though I think he's worded it very slightly differently. He said, "My father would often say, a revolution is an idea, and an idea cannot be killed." Well, what more is there to say, other than perhaps this award for Raid tonight is testament to that. Thank you.
Mike, thank you ever so much for that, for bringing something of Riyad Faraz's character, personality to us this evening, and showing why he is a worthy recipient of this year's Courage in Journalism Award. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, as we draw to a close this evening, I want to end, as Mike did, on a note of optimism. Because while we've heard some tragic stories tonight, there is much to be optimistic about. Last year, we had 75 journalists on the long list, all of whom had been killed in the course of doing their job. This year, that number is 55. We long for a time when an award like this is no longer necessary, but nonetheless, that is progress. When I stood here last year to present the award, it was just days after the murder of Lyra McKee, the first journalist to be killed in the UK for nearly 20 years. Paul Karuna Galizia was sat in the front row, and while I knew he was optimistic about seeing breakthrough in his mother's case, there had been no significant developments. The case had effectively stalled. Today, in both cases, we've seen major breakthrough. 2 weeks ago, a man appeared in court charged with the murder of Lyra McKee. In Malta, Prime Minister Joseph Muscat resigned last month amid a constitutional and political crisis sparked by Daphne's murder. In both cases, the truth is slowly breaking through. As Mike said, light can shine even in the darkest of places. I'm also hugely encouraged by the hope and inspiration shown in the lives of the people we've looked at tonight. It's truly inspiring that people like Riyad Faraz refuse to give up and refuse to give in, even amid all the pressure that they came under. Of course, it's utterly unacceptable that he paid with his life, but the spirit he showed lives on, not least in his son Mahmoud Faraz. As Mahmoud said in his video, his father embodied an idea, and an idea cannot be killed. And you only have to look at the likes of Annabel Hernandez to see that the spirit and courage is alive and active and cannot be subdued. History shows us that freedom can rebound even after long stints of oppression. It just needs an opportunity to flourish. The basic desire for democratic liberties, our inbuilt desire for truth, including access to honest, fact-based journalism, will never be extinguished. And that, ladies and gentlemen, gives me cause for hope. And so what is our role in this? As consumers of news, I believe we should seek out journalism that matters. If we read the stories from local journalists in Syria and Mexico, if we share them, we help to feed that desire for truth. We make it harder to ignore the local journalists. We become part of the force to reverse media oppression. We may not be on the front line supplying the news, but we can certainly help to create the demand. And to those of you who do find yourselves on the front lines, and I know there are several in the room tonight, not least our judging panel, keep writing what matters. What you do is so important, so keep going. Thank you.